Hello, I'm Paul Whitcake, founder and CEO of the Alliance of Chief Executives. Good morning to everyone joining us from across the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and good afternoon to all the leaders joining us from Europe. I'm excited to welcome you to the first of what will be an ongoing series of Alliance Visionary Leaders Roundtables, in which we will enable leaders from around the world to come together to discuss how innovative leaders are changing how we live and work in ways that none of us can fully appreciate or understand. First, I'd like to thank our panelists who agreed to join us today to collectively discuss how they envision the future of health and healthcare. I'd also like to thank all of our leaders who are joining us today. With no disrespect to the leaders on our panel, there is more collective wisdom among all of the leaders in our audience. I founded the Alliance 25 years ago when I thought the world was at an inflection point after Netscape went public and the internet and globalization were changing the world in ways never before possible. Today, I have the privilege to work with CEOs in every industry, and I believe we are on the cusp of a technological revolution, not only in healthcare, but in every industry. It became clear that the ability to access massive amounts of data combined with incredible advances in high-speed computing, communications, AI, automation, imaging, robotics, and so many other new technologies that would enable incredible advances in all areas of healthcare. I believe the opportunity to deliver personalized precision healthcare will radically change the future of our health and our longevity. The pace of change is so great that no leader can stay up to date. By coming together, I believe we can all learn faster and make better decisions with more confidence. Today's roundtable may focus on health and healthcare, but whether we are personally involved in the healthcare industry or not, it applies to all of us. I believe that disruptive innovation typically comes from the outside, when we get to know leaders in other industries that are able to borrow or steal new ideas to transform our own organizations and industries. So before we begin, please understand that everyone is muted so we can listen to our panelists discuss their views of the future from different perspectives, ranging from diagnostics, drug discovery, and gene editing, to therapeutics, robotic surgery, healthcare services, and beyond. Now it's my privilege to introduce you to my partner for this special roundtable, Alliance alumni Walter Moose, who will be our moderator for today's roundtable. I had the privilege to meet Walter 7 years ago when he joined the Alliance, and he is one of the most respected and connected life sciences leader I've ever met. 2 years ago, when COVID forced us all to learn how to come together virtually on Zoom, I soon realized that we could bring leaders together in ways that weren't possible before. One of the first people I called was Walter, who helped put this amazing panel together. Walter has been involved in drug discovery in both academia and industry since the 1970s. He's the managing director and co-founder of Pandec BioVentures, chairman emeritus of Shang Pharma Innovation, past president of biosciences at the Stanford Research Institute, and has served on the UCSF faculty for 3 decades. He also finds time to sit on half a dozen public and private boards in the US and Asia. Walter, it's all yours.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks to our panelists and viewers for joining us today. It's nice to see you all here. Allow me to start by asking each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and I'm going to give you this as the first of a couple of tall orders. I ask you to introduce yourselves in 30 to 60 seconds apiece. Joe, would you start us off, please?
Yeah, so thank you, Walter, and thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Wu. I'm a professor in the Department of Medicine and Radiology at Stanford, and also director of the Stanford Cardiovascular Institute. I'm a cardiologist by training. I also run a very large and busy lab in which we work on clinical genomics, genome editing, AI, machine learning, and human-induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPS cells. And then our main goals are to, number one, understand the basic disease mechanisms so that we could accelerate drug discovery, and then develop this clinical trial in a dish concept so that we can then implement precision medicine for our patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Bill?
Thank you, Walter. I recently stepped down as CEO of SRI International, and I'm now creating a new venture fund focused on early stage deep tech. I have a PhD in astrophysics, so a little bit different than most of the other panelists. And I spent the first half of my career in the US government, including time at DARPA, the White House, and as director of NIST. The second half of my career has been as a CEO of research institutions both for-profit and nonprofit, with a focus on use-inspired basic research and its transition to commercial products. I'd like to thank you for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be here today and to participate with such an impressive group of thought leaders.
Thank you, Bill. John.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is John Murphy. I'm originally from London. I came to the US in 1989 for school. And I've got a pretty broad background in aerospace and life science tools and diagnostics, imaging and devices. But the last 10 years, I've been working on a mini robot for general surgery abdominal procedures at Virtual Incision. So it's very nice to be with you all.
Thank you, John. Ted.
Morning, everyone. I'm Ted Love. I'm CEO of a company called Global Blood Therapeutics. My background is that of a medical biologist and cardiologist by training, but I've spent about the last 30 years in industry, where I started out at Genentech and eventually was head of drug development for Genentech. Right now, I'm focused on sickle cell disease. At GBT, we're actually trying to make small molecules that modify hemoglobin to make it non-polymerizing. We think that approach can actually cure sickle cell disease around the world. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all.
Thank you, Ted. Rachel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Harwitz, and I'm the president and CEO of Caribou Bio, a biotech company that I helped co-found about a decade ago. Caribou is a CRISPR genome editing company, and we use that technology to develop off-the-shelf cellular therapies for various kinds of cancers. For those of you unfamiliar with CRISPR genome editing, it's a technology that allows us to go inside of living cells and precisely change their DNA sequences. At Caribou, we use this to modify immune cells, such as T cells, to teach them how to find and fight certain kinds of cancers. Great to be here today.
Thank you, Rachel. And last but not least, Amir.
Great. Wow. Impressive panel and moderators. So thank you all for having me. I'm Amir Rubin. I'm chair and CEO of One Medical. We're a modernized primary care organization that combines in-person care and digital health. We took the company public in the last couple of years, and we were in about 8 markets a couple of years ago. We'll be in 28 this year, with reach to 40% of the US, serving from children to adults to now seniors, serving consumers, employers, and also folks in capitated or at-risk health plans. I spent most of my career in healthcare systems, where I've had the pleasure to run across some of these amazing, brilliant people on this panel. Prior to this, I was executive vice president at Optum United Health Group, but before that was CEO at Stanford's healthcare system, and before that, COO at UCLA's health system. Pleased to be with y'all.
Thank you, Amir. What an amazing group. So Joe, we're back to you. Now, the second tall order here is to say what you think the next 5 to 10 years is going to look like in 3 minutes or less. And then we'll go back, Amir, we'll be right back to you after Joe.
Okay, thank you, Walter. I think as Paul mentioned, each one of us as speakers will bring different perspectives to the discussion. From our experience in a variety of healthcare sectors, such as drug discovery, diagnostics, robotics, medical devices, gene editing devices, and so forth. Now, from my perspective as a physician scientist working in academic center like Stanford, I have had the privilege to be able to see each one of these facets really over the past 20 years of my career. And I've gained a tremendous understanding as well as respect for how difficult it is and how long this whole process may take. And so for the many different types of scenarios in terms of how healthcare technology or health tech can be used over the next 5 years to improve the lives of patients, I just want to highlight one particular example, which is the concept of clinical trial in a dish. This concept of clinical trial in a dish involves testing therapeutics for safety and efficacy by using human tissues. Now, in the past, it has been quite difficult to get access to human tissues other than just blood. This has now become possible due to the human-induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPS cells technology. These iPS cells that allows us to generate patient-specific, disease-specific, and tissue-specific cell types that has never been possible before. And then in our lab, combined with organs on a chip, gene editing, whole genome sequencing, and also patients' clinical information, I think it's going to have a major impact on early drug discovery, on lead optimization for safety and efficacy, on informing regulatory decision making by the FDA, and also expanding the number of indications based on these in vitro data. So I think this is especially important also for rare orphan diseases, in which a lot of times it's very difficult to recruit these patients. And I would say we also have the moral responsibility to provide the safest and most efficacious drug to them, so that hopefully the therapeutics have already been tested and then pre-screen using the patient's own iPS cells. Now, lastly, because of that, my entire lab at Stanford with about 50 people is all vested on working on this clinical trial in a dish concept for multiple diseases. But then I also realized it is very difficult and also very slow to make this transition from academic discoveries to commercialization. So to kind of bridge this gap, we have recently set up a company called Greenstone Biosciences, whereby our goal is to combine clinical genomics, AI, machine learning, genome editing, and a large biobank of these human-specific iPS cells to accelerate drug discovery. And I'll stop here, Walter. Yeah.
Thank you, Joe. State of the art on every front. Amir, what's the future look like to you?
Well, Walter, you did a number on me. I got to go last on the intros, which is something I can almost not fail, but I have to go second in front of all of these luminaries who are innovating the future of healthcare and medicine. So thanks for the seating here. Yeah, what Joe said. Let me comment a little bit on maybe the future of delivery and healthcare delivery, which is where I've spent most of my care. And I think actually the future is pretty well described in the past. We just haven't, as an ecosystem, executed well upon that. So what are some of the things we already know and we've already seen? From a consumer or patient perspective, we want a better experience. We want easier access. We want it 24/7. We want it in person or virtual, whatever meets our needs. And we want the answers quickly. So increase, if you will, in consumerism and seamless of access. Experience matters. We're used to having seamless experience in other aspects of our lives. Healthcare is approaching 20% of GDP. Why can't it be a decent experience? And again, I don't think that's new, but I think we're going to put up with less in the future. And we're seeing innovative companies like my own and others pushing the boundaries. We have a 90 Net Promoter Score. We have virtual care with no at the margin cost, 24/7 with 1 to 2 minute response, synchronously or asynchronously. We have same or next day appointments in hundreds of locations that look very lovely, that accept your insurance. We're in network across the country. So I think that this service experience, I think a second thing that we know and we've seen in the past is we want better health outcomes. Our healthcare system has been largely focused around the acute care side of things, which, thankfully, if you have a complex condition, the things that many of the folks here, Ted and John and Rachel and Joe are working on, boy, I want those things. That's amazing. There's a lot of lifestyle type things that we can do to hopefully prevent chronic diseases. And we don't do a good job in the healthcare system of focusing around that. So how do we focus on kind of the reservoir of issues, the things that we know are going to happen? We're dealing with 88-year-old seniors. It's really hard to prevent diabetes at that point, but we're dealing with 45-year-old folks, and there are interventions we can do, and they might be therapeutics, they might be lifestyle, they might be behavioral, but they do need support. And so how do we advance health and health outcomes so we could all live longer, healthier lives, even as we continue to have hopefully the great breakthroughs on the acute care side. And then I think a third point, final point here is, what is all this going to cost and how do we deliver greater value in healthcare? And I think, again, we've been moving on this question. This is a global question, not just for US healthcare. And I think a lot of folks are waiting for the magic reimbursement system or the magic health policy. And I'm going to say they're not coming or they haven't yet. So I think it's, how do we be disruptive from within the ecosystem? How do we take the current reimbursement systems, Medicare, Medicaid, commercial insurance, and deliver value through them. And that's one of the things that we try to do at One Medical. We had a nice paper published last year in JAMA Network Open where we showed we took out 45% of the cost from an employer, largely by averting 40 to 50% of the emergency room and specialty costs by having easier access to primary care, and then paying our providers on a salary basis so they're not incentivized to have fee-for-service visits and a lot of them and refer everything out. Not actually rocket science innovation. The trick is how do you do that within the existing ecosystem and reimbursement systems. And finally, we've built a technology platform that allows us to do that. So better experience, better health outcomes, lower costs, and innovating within the ecosystem, I think are some of the things that we'll continue to see.
Thank you, Amir. I think you just described what we would all like to see. So we're pulling for you. Rachel.
Sure. So I think from my perspective and the work that we do at Caribou, what I'll focus on today is that I think over the next 5 to 10 years, Walter, we're going to see the real rollout of what I'll call genetic medicines, and ultimately the opportunity for patients to have access to 3 modalities of therapies, whereas today they really have 2. So today patients primarily when they're ill with something have access to maybe a small molecule drug, a small chemical, or perhaps an antibody, for example, in the context of cancer care or other situations. And that's about it. But work that companies like Caribou and so many others are doing right now are really pushing the future of the kinds of therapeutic interventions. And I use the term genetic medicines quite broadly. I think there are a lot of ways to intervene really at the genetic level of a disease. And it ranges anywhere from what many of us have probably experienced over the past 12 to 18 months with respect to the new messenger RNA vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic, through to viral vectors that can be used for gene therapy to actually deliver a copy of a missing or mutated gene that a patient needs for their lives, all the way through to cellular-based therapies. So really therapies that are based in addressing the genetic underpinning of the disease itself, that in some instances actually carry the potential for a cure, which is incredibly exciting to think about. So Walter, I'll just maybe summarize it there as I think about the next 5 to 10 years. It's really the broader availability of genetic medicines for a wider number of patients.
Thank you, Rachel. Clearly part of the current revolution in medicines. Ted, the next 5 to 10 years, what does it look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, following up on Rachel's point, I think that the technology, the great technology that is often invented in our academic institutions and applied by companies like Rachel, that's going to continue. Our country is the best at doing that. We incentivize that. And that kind of approach allows us to cure people from diseases that were completely egregious only a short while ago, like SMA, for example, we heard about over the last couple of years. But Walter, I think we've also got to do something about healthcare disparities. I think we saw during the pandemic that the simple things that we don't do well in our healthcare system are costing us a great deal of money. And I think ultimately, the pain and suffering of people that are live in certain zip codes, people that look certain ways, that don't get good health care, we're going to have to deal with that. I was struck the other night in looking at some of the statistics just about COVID, recognizing that I think we've now crossed 900,000 deaths in the United States. China, which is about 4 times the size of our country, I think has had less than 2,000 deaths from COVID. So we've got to structurally revisit how we deliver healthcare in this country if we are going to really get the outcomes for all of us.
Thank you, Ted. Such important points, and a lot of questions that have come in are around healthcare access and cost. So I think we'll get back to that in a moment. John, the future from your perspective.
Yes, Walter, as I mentioned, I'm working in the world of surgical robotics, which really has become a sizzling hot sector in medical devices. There's roots with the pioneer of the market, Intuitive Surgical, with SRI and these types of institutions here in the Valley. And they've done an amazing job, I think, just passing their 10 millionth surgery, robotic surgery. So quite incredible over the last couple of decades. But at Virtual Incision, for example, we're trying to enable minimally invasive surgery in the other 80 or 90% of ORs around the world. So today, I think in the US, robotic surgery makes up about 10% of procedures. And worldwide, it's really just 2% of procedures. But in order to enable these tremendous benefits of minimally invasive robotic assisted surgeries, you need to have a cost-effective, much less complex, mobile approach that can go to the community hospital, to rural settings, to the ASC, the surgery center in the US, but then of course, have access outside the US. So I think we're gonna see an inversion over the next 10 to 20 years from not just 10% procedures, but 90% of procedures in surgery involving some robotic surgery. The other side of this leads more into medical devices writ largely. There's data with everything now. Just our little robot, for example, throws off 100,000 lines of operations per second, and you do all the deep learning AI stuff on the surgical video and the like. But I think every new device coming to market has some element of this big data approach that will support the efficacy and the deployment of such devices. So I think there's a sea change coming around this. Just in robotics, it's really becoming table stakes for every OR. My co-founder, CMO, would say it's robotics is like adding an automatic transmission to help a surgeon perform a procedure more easily. And if you can add an extra procedure per day to an OR or move it to any OR or any site of care, I think that's a little bit of the game changer that we're trying to address. And device being part of the future in acute care.
Thank you, John. Clearly the technologies that you're developing and others in your space are going to be part of the future of medicine. And they are today already, but even more amazing as we go forward. And Bill, if you could wrap up here on your vision of the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. I'm actually, Walter, I'm going to actually riff on Paul's opening remarks, because where I really see the future is that we're at the confluence of two powerful trends that have been going on. One is the maturation of decades of research in the synthesis of bio, nano, and info. And the second is a financially unsustainable healthcare system that's absolutely ripe for disruption. So I may be a little bit optimistic, but let me expound on how these trends are going to positively impact society by accelerating drug discovery, improving drug delivery, and even more impactfully, empowering the individual to own their own wellness, and in the process, create new trillion-dollar industries. So in terms of discovery, the fusion of expertise of bio, nano, and info has proven difficult for traditional pharma to efficiently implement. Their return on investment on research investments in pharma is now around 2%, which is below their weighted average cost of capital. So pharma has been shifting more towards procuring discoveries external to their own labs. And this is facilitating a robust startup ecosystem where the fusion of disciplines is easier and creates new capabilities that can be acquired by traditional pharma. In terms of delivery, there have been radical advances in targeting specific cell types to attack, utilizing chemical and mechanical ways to cross the blood-brain barrier, and even robotic pills for mediated release of drugs based upon sensing the body's current physical state. These advances will not only improve care, but reduce side effects that can be debilitating. And with respect to empowering the individual, there's already a shift starting from a focus on disease treatment and care to wellness. Deloitte did a study and they estimated that in the US, the current spending is about 80% on care and 20% on wellness. They expect this to shift by 2040 to 40% on care and 60% on wellness, tripling the fraction of the spend on wellness. Some of the most important things that are likely to then be facilitated is rapid, cheap diagnostics, moving from central laboratories to point of care and eventually into the home. Think about COVID. How would the evolution of COVID have changed if everyone could easily and reliably test themselves multiple times a day? MEMS, nanosensors, advanced microelectronics and signal processing, microfluidics, new biomarkers, and even exploiting new phenomenologies is making this a reality. More and more testing will shift from the lab to doctor's office and making screening more routine and eventually cheap enough for people to do it at home. Similarly, there's going to be a greater use of continuous health monitoring through wearable technologies that provide medical or near medical grade sensing. The Apple Watch, is really sort of the first and early example of non-obtrusive continuous health monitoring. And much more technology and signal processing are being incorporated into future wearables to really expand the physiology being monitored. And what this allows is a baselining of that individual health, not averaging to a broad demographic. And with that new baseline, the detection of small shifts in health can be detected much earlier, as well as understanding diurnal or emotional driven health changes. Now, the rate limiting step, and Joe mentioned this, is really the regulatory environment. With a focus on safety, this is going to evolve slowly. So there needs to be an approach to leverage technology to guarantee the same or greater level of safety while ensuring accuracy and efficacy. Greater in silico modeling, use of artificial organs, genotype specific assessments, even digital twins and major body functions may need to be developed and incorporated into the regulatory process to radically speed up the approval. And investors have noticed these trends and they're deploying capital to accelerate the transformation. And there's a really significant increase in activity in startups. Venture funding in health and wellness is growing with a CAGR of more than 33%. And there's more than 90 existing unicorns in healthcare. So bottom line, massive investments in bio, nano, and info have over the past few decades really paying off at an increasingly rapid pace. And over the next decade, we're going to see fundamental improvements in drug discovery, delivery, and I think most important, the empowering of individuals to own their wellness. So in the process, there's going to be massive new markets created to develop and supply these capabilities. So I'm very bullish. So thank you.
That's a wonderful way to tie this all together and to look to a very technologically sophisticated but easy to plug into future. Thank you, Bill. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to save my remarks about the future for the discussion that's going to follow. But before we go there, I think we should play a video that Matai Mammon, who couldn't join us today because of his new responsibilities at J&J. So could we cue that video now, please?
Hello, everyone. My name is Matai Mammon, and I am the Executive Vice President at J&J, responsible for global pharmaceuticals R&D. Thank you very much, Paul, for the invitation to speak for a few minutes, and I apologize again for not being there in person. So at J&J, we have a team of about 14,000 people in research and development and spend about $10 billion a year or over that. All of this resource is focused on anticipating a future. So it anticipates a future as it relates to the most devastating illnesses that we all face. It anticipates the direction of science, of data science, and of engineering. And all of it is aimed at making medicines and vaccines that we want to change the trajectory of human health. I thought I'd illustrate with an example. So let me tell you about Carvykti, and let me tell you about a patient called Sean. So Sean is an example of a person that was recently in our clinical trials, and he was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. He had 5 years of the most advanced therapies that exist today, and those helped him for a period, but ultimately he failed them all, and he was told he was going to die. There was nothing left. He and his family of 5 were, as you can understand, beyond devastated at what was happening. He learned of our program and entered a clinical trial. So what happened to him is as follows. First, we took blood from him and separated the lymphocytes in his blood from all the other components of his blood. We used a technique that then inserted a special protein on the surface of these lymphocytes, of these T cells, called chimeric antigen receptor, or CAR. This expresses on the surface of his own T cells a protein that helps these T cells find the cancer. And what happened after that was nearly miraculous. His body, prior to this treatment, was riddled with tumor, and it cleared completely. So as an illustration of that, a month after the injection, a bone marrow biopsy was taken and 9 million cells were removed and examined. And not a single one of those 9 million cells was a tumor cell. He was tumor-free. And after this one injection, remains tumor-free today, a couple of years later. And so Sean is the reason we do what we do, and many people like Sean. So new modalities like cell therapy, gene therapy, RNA therapeutics, RNA vaccines, they're adding to the toolkit in addition to small tablets and injected antibodies. And as we learn to use these new modalities, we can act now on ideas that make sense biologically and medically in a way we couldn't do before. So there's been a revolution in these biological technologies, these modalities. Parallel with this modality revolution is a revolution that's happening in data science. New kinds of data are coming in by the petabyte, and data types such as images and sound are helping us redefine diseases. These data help us understand biology, help us understand who to treat and when with a specific medicine that works by a particular mechanism. And at J&J, we're fully invested in data science as well as these new modalities, and we believe these will lead us to the next frontier of how medicines are made and developed. So all in all, I ask my team every single day to stay focused on the mission: change people's lives by harnessing ideas in science and medicine and using new biological tools and data science fully. This takes a mission orientation, of course, but also takes individuals that are tremendously intellectually curious and have an openness to learn. And it takes an organizational change culturally to just embrace the new, be bold, embrace what's necessary to change the lives of humans. So best of luck with the conversation today. Thank you very much.
Virtual thanks to Matai. Again, he was very sorry that he couldn't be here to join us. At this point, we're going to go into an interactive discussion with the panel, and allow me to start that discussion, and then we'll have a free range commentary from you all on what I say or what someone else has said or something completely new. So there are no rules at this point. But I thought to look to the future, we should first look to the past. And many people don't understand how long it actually takes for new technologies to take hold in the world. And there are really 3 stages to this, each of which takes 20 to 30 years, looking back even to railroads, for example, and before that as well. So it takes 20 to 30 years for fundamental technology to move from being novel to it becoming a major product, reaching a broad market. In the case of Ted Love's Global Blood, they did it in 10 years, but that's not the norm. It takes another 20 to 30 years for a discovery to reach a profitable peak, and yet another 20 to 30 years for it to change human behavior at a national and international level. So Isaac Newton was right when he wrote in the 1600s that we stand on the shoulders of giants, giants who were there many years before us. So remarkably, I'm talking about 60 to 90 years for revolutions in biomedical science technology in particular for it to fully take hold, basically a lifetime. So I'm going to give 2 examples here and then open the floor to discussion. First of all, penicillium molds were known to have antibiotic properties in the 1800s, but it wasn't until the late 1920s that penicillin was discovered, and that wasn't mass produced until the 1940s. So a very long period of time there. But perhaps the best example is what's happened today in COVID-19, most visibly in the form of effective COVID-19 vaccines, reaping the benefits of RNA research that goes back 20 to 30 years. And another part of the RNA equation relates to the lipid nanoparticles, which are used for protection and delivery of RNA vaccines and other types of therapeutics. Liposomes were the predecessors of lipid nanoparticles, and they were first described in the early 1960s, about 60 years ago. And if you want to go back 90 years, the role of RNA in protein synthesis was first suspected in the 1930s. So there you have it. This is what it takes to build a revolution. It doesn't happen overnight, but this is what it takes to be durable. So let me stop there and open this to whomever on the panel would like to have the next word.
Walter, I think that's good perspective. I was at Genentech, as you know, when we started to make these antibodies, Rituxan, Herceptin. There was a ton of skepticism for these antibodies being worth anything because we had this exuberance about antibodies as therapies, and then more than a decade of problems. And but we did finally break through. But I think your point on it always takes longer and costs more is good advice.
Yeah, I'll echo. I think it's sobering, actually, what you described, Walter, when you actually look back. I'm going to be a little bit more bullish and optimistic looking forward in certain areas, not so much on the discovery phase, because I think, the discovery phase, as long as it's still controlled by humans and human thought and interaction, it's going to take a long time, right? Fundamental new breakthroughs take a while, but I think the adoption phase can be faster. If you look at how, you mentioned 20 to 30 years of really fundamentally changing behavior, you look at things like cell phones, I would argue that transformation in society was much faster than that. And, as Joe talked a little bit about what, the work that they're doing at Stanford that may impact the regulatory environment. So I would agree with you up to this point, but I would think that I'm cautiously optimistic, maybe naively optimistic, that with the amount of effort and resources that are being put towards it, new technologies in terms of these things, that we can actually accelerate the dissemination of a lot of these new discoveries so that they can create social good faster.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to piggyback off of a point that Bill just made. I think he's spot on with respect to the evolving regulatory landscape and actually how critical that is in terms of getting some of these new potential therapies across the finish line and commercially available. Even just thinking back to the video we heard just a few minutes ago from the leader at J&J, that product candidate is not yet approved, but hopefully will be approved later this year. And it's a kind of T-cell based cellular therapy. That entire class of therapies that exist on the commercial market today have all been approved based off of phase 2 data. So if you think about kind of drug development 101, you learn about phase 1, followed by phase 2, typically followed by multiple phase 3 studies with very large patient populations. And that's a huge part of what takes so much time and so much capital in terms of advancing these kinds of potential therapies. And yet, at least here in the United States, the FDA is starting to take an incredibly creative and collaborative approach to these new modalities of medicines. And the entire first wave of these cellular therapies have been approved off of fairly small, let's call it 60 to 100 patient phase 2 studies. And I think it's a huge component of how we can start to chip away at some of these timelines. One of the real challenges, Walter, presented by the timelines that you've outlined here is simply how do companies make money at the end of all of that? When you think about one of the really key tools being intellectual property, owning the rights to the patents that cover the therapy, when it takes quite a long time to even launch that drug in the first place, often it's only a small number of years that you still have exclusivity over that molecule, that drug, that compound, in order to try to make back some of the money that had been spent in the development of the product in the first place.
I was just going to add to the great discussion here that it's also interesting to reflect on how maybe certain times or points of inflections may be able to accelerate certain things. Obviously we've gone through a pandemic here. Our company, we're in our 15th year 15 years ago, we decided to have an app that you can get on to book an appointment and have a virtual visit. There was no billing, there was no code, so we just did it for free. And 15 years later, people are like, oh, maybe it would be nice to be able to do this from home, right? And by the way, Medicare has still not changed its reimbursement criteria outside of the pandemic emergency, which is a virtual visit for a senior on the books right now is only for a rural senior done with the provider sitting in a medical clinic. Except for this period of a health emergency. And by the way, every provider must get licensed in a different state. And what happens if you live in Manhattan but are temporarily living in Connecticut? Can that provider see you? So there's all these, regulatory challenges we heard on the drug development side and FDA, but certainly on the care delivery side as well. But there are these points of inflection, hopefully, that some people say, gosh, this is kind of ridiculous. Ted's pretty darn smart. He trained at Harvard, but not smart enough to give care in California. Well, he could only give care in Boston, right? Like, I don't know. I think he's probably pretty darn good. But we still have this regulatory environment and all the stakeholders that we have in our ecosystem often have our system regress to the mean. So I was going to be a little more pessimistic on the future. The future will look a lot more like the present, probably. But I do think we have these points of inflection that maybe we move people along, whether it's the regulatory environment or the consumer environment. Will people go back to not being able to talk to provider at nights or weekends about the care of their children? Hard to see that. Will employers, say, gee, I don't need this kind of hybrid environment, even though my work is in a hybrid environment now? Hard to see that. So hopefully we can take advantage of some of these points of inflections and have regulatory, commercial points of inflection as well, because some of the innovations we've had and known for a while, right? Certainly on the care delivery side, most of what we're doing is not unknown. It's the piecing it together, executing at scale, and navigating the current ecosystem.
I was hoping you all would push back on what I said. Joe, do you want to continue that?
I think I'll push back as well. I think what you say was, I would say, historical cases in which, textbook cases. I think, with recent advances in AI, machine learning, recent advances in CRISPR genome editing, recent advances in, the stem cell biology and so forth, I think the pace of drug discovery will probably be faster. I think the FDA is also aware that they may be the last man standing in terms of holding up the whole process. So in my interactions with the FDA, they've been much more receptive. In our case, accepting the iPSL-based data. It's almost like a sneak preview in terms of what's going on. So you'll see there are a lot of startup companies that will be focusing on rare orphan diseases in which they have the clinical genomics data, they have the patient data to test their drug product on these patient-specific iPSL data. They validated the PK/PD in mouse, and then they're ready to present to the FDA for a phase 1 trial or IND enabling phase 1 trial. So I'm much more optimistic that hopefully in the future it won't take us 60 years to get there. And I think also the consumers, our patients demand that, because otherwise, not only will we fall behind, not able to deliver the care, but we'll also fall behind compared to other countries that I think will surpass us. Yeah.
Excellent. John, do you want to add to this?
Walter, what you mentioned resonates. I think if you're a medical device entrepreneur, you have to brace yourself for a 7-year on the low end, or a 10-year, maybe a 15-year type of journey. But I joke with my co-founder. He's a MIT PhD roboticist, Mars rover guy. He's been cranking on this, humble guy from Nebraska, been cranking on these robots for 20 years. And I said, don't worry, Shane, you're going to be a 20-year overnight success. So I see Amir's company just take off. I'm kind of glad to hear it took 15 years in some ways, because we've been all cranking away. But oh my gosh, when I hear that you're going to 28 markets, Amir, and that you're executing at scale, and I think we're going to do some good things and bring little robots to all sorts of places that couldn't even think about it, and enable MIS in different corners of the globe that couldn't even think about it. So it's this long incubation, tough regulatory, really tough hurdles. It's not yet there on AI tools, and there's a lot to move forward in those areas. But then if you have these breakthrough things, that's where the optimism comes. If you can make it through all that, then you get out the other side and you can do some great things. So, but that's the nature of it, I think.
So John and maybe Bill, how long is it going to take to get to nanorobots that start diagnosing and treating us?
Bill's got the physics. We're not quite at nano. We're at 2-pound robots, and it's all robot assisted, right? So it's all surgeon led. There's tools along the way, right, to really help, automate these things with, AI and these types of tools. But again, they're decades out, really. So really, we're just trying to get the base tools into the hands of the surgeons to enable kind of MIS in these more broadly and a cost-effective way. But nano, people have got micro robots for neuro. You're the physics guy, Bill. You gotta go full nano on us now.
That's right. I mean, I would say that it's still a ways off just because of the controls of that. But I think a lot of the core technologies that would be necessary to have, small nano devices inside the body, whether or not it's clearing out a clog in the arteries or whether or not it's delivering, as I said, a mediated amount of drug based upon some kind of local sensing of the body, is not that far away. It's not full up nano taking over, John's work and doing surgery for you, but I think there is some things that we're going to start to see over the next couple of years. I've seen a number of startups that are working in this area. So I think it's coming.
So we're still going to need physicians like Matai and Ted and Joe and Amir. So you're all set. But
Absolutely.
Rachel's gonna just fix this from the start with genetic medicines, right?
Well, maybe in some cases is probably the best answer to that. I think what's often forgotten is that the vast majority of diseases don't have a clear and simple genetic underpinning. There are, depending on how you count, something like 7,000 diseases that are known that are caused by a single gene mutation. And those are potentially eligible for treatment through some sort of genetic-based medicine. But the vast majority of diseases that we or our families face are caused by incredibly complex interactions between a wide variety of different genetic elements or genetic underpinnings. So there is no magic bullet for the vast majority of these. I also want to point out, I think one of the current bottlenecks in ultimately using these kinds of genetic medicines as broadly as I hope they will be in the future is delivery. And this is actually something that Bill mentioned in some of his remarks earlier. And what I mean by that is actually how do you get these proteins, messenger RNAs, or other molecules into the tissue and into the cells that matter most? Today, the field has fairly limited capabilities on this front, all things considered. There are some kinds of cells that we can actually take outside the body and manipulate, such as T cells, blood stem cells, and a few others. So that's one path. You actually take the cells you need, bring them to the lab, do the editing there, and put them back into the patient. And the other is to try to actually directly deliver them where you need them to go. And today, they're basically two organs that people broadly know how to deliver to, the liver and the eye. As I'm sure you can imagine, there are a long laundry list of diseases that cannot be treated by targeting the liver or the eye. So I think the field has a tremendous amount of work to be done to figure out how to either repurpose existing technologies or develop new technologies to target these systems to the right tissue types.
Great, great perspective.
Walter, I just want to add, I'm not pessimistic. I didn't mean to sound pessimistic, but the areas of innovation that I've seen move the quickest has been when we've taken existing technology and reapply it in a new area. I mean, CRISPR, for example, we were using CRISPR in the labs for many, many years, and now Rachel is using it in humans. And it's really, as you said, based on a lot of existing information. I'm excited about telemedicine. I think we can do a lot around my point in healthcare disparities by using technology that already exists to really interact with patients in a more equitable way. I think John was the one who mentioned, or Bill, this wearable technology. I'm very excited that wearable technology is going to allow us to gather data in a more equitable way and act on it. And then finally, someone mentioned the FDA. I think we've also, not only the FDA, but all of us kind of have to get out of our way. I think a lot of the reason that we don't move fast is that we're very tradition bound. And one of the things that I've really been struck by lately is how much real world data is driving the discussion. Not randomized placebo-controlled data, but we talk about Omicron. We don't have any randomized placebo-controlled data, but we're completely convinced, right, that Omicron is less virulent, more transmissible, but less virulent than Delta. So using real world data, I think particularly for our big medical problems, not necessarily our rare diseases, but I think that's going to be very important now. So I think if we use existing technology, that's how we will make the biggest advances in the short term. Anytime I think you go out on a new branch, you're going to learn things that you didn't expect. When we came up with the first beta blocker, I think we learned that there were more beta receptors in beta than we knew, because we started to see side effects that we didn't anticipate. And I think that's been my experience. Every time we come up with a new drug, we see things that we didn't even know, because these drugs actually act as probes to tell us what we don't know. I think the body of knowledge that we don't know, sadly, is dramatically bigger than the body of knowledge that we do understand.
Wonderful perspective. Wonderful perspective. All right. Well, so I've been looking at the Q&A that came in beforehand and some of what's come in today. And I'm seeing 4 categories that might be topics that we could riff on for the next half hour or so. One is, as we talked about earlier, Ted, how to address healthcare access and cost. This gets right into Amir's space as well, and especially given the great disparities nationally and internationally. Another is, what have we learned from COVID that can be applied to the future? Interestingly, not as many questions as I would have expected directly onto how are we going to get out of this COVID, out of this coronavirus, this pandemic. Another is more in the tech side with artificial intelligence and digital health. What's the role of AI and digital health in the next generation of healthcare? And then lastly, more of a policy question, I guess, and involving the government, how to improve the public health dialogue, which has been confused at times during this pandemic. So did anyone hear a topic there that they would like to start a discussion on?
Walt, since I brought it up, I'll start with healthcare disparities and the role of government. As you probably know, I'm vice chair of bio, and one of the things that we've been advocating a great deal is reduction, and personally, I think elimination of healthcare copays. And this actually is a very personal topic for me, and I suspect anybody who's practiced medicine, because as physicians and healthcare providers, we spend our time very concerned about our patients. And many times we know that a simple medicine could be highly effective for them. Yet we write that prescription and the patient goes to fill it and they're hit with a bill. And that bill, the biggest impact of that bill is to discourage them from taking that medicine. And it's quite strange, quite frankly, that if we're really concerned about the health and outcomes of individuals, when we prescribe an antihypertensive for someone, that we make them pay part of the cost. Why are we doing that? The only goal here really is to reduced utilization of that resource. So I think we are going to have to think very differently about how we pay for healthcare in this country if we're going to seriously deal with healthcare disparities. And I would probably put copays for healthcare at the top of the list. Nobody wants to take Rituxan. No, nobody wants to take Oxbryta. Nobody wants to take Gleevec. Why are we putting a barrier in place for those therapies? So I'm very emotional about it. And I think that hopefully, as a country, we'll stand up and start to realize that putting barriers of cost in between patients who are sick and the therapies that they need is not a good idea.
Let me add on to Ted's great points. I totally agree with some examples. So we started doing digital health. There was no CPT codes. There was no reimbursement. We thought people would want it. So we said, you know what, we'll charge people $15 a month, which is still what we do as a membership fee. And you could have all you can eat, which is the case. And what happened? In a typical under 65 population, you have 1 to 2 visits per person per year or contacts. We have 12. We have about 1 to 2 in person and the rest are digital. So we reduced the friction to that access. And then on the back end, what did we do? Well, if you pay the physician every time only somebody comes into the office and only if you do something to them, then you only get office visits. And we said, look, we'll pay our own team members, our physicians. It doesn't matter. Email, message, video, virtual, just take care of the person. So what happened? We reduced that barrier to access. And then, to Ted's point about health equity, then we said, well, gee, let's make sure that those of us who are delivering the care can relate to our members, our patients. And so we look, over the last decade, tried to have a team that better reflects the communities that we serve. And we're now about 45% as a team, people of color. About a third of our providers are people of color. We're actually about 70% women, because we've been able to have very flexible schedules, and women still are disproportionately carrying a lot of the family responsibilities. But since we always had this hybrid environment of working virtual and in office, I'm like, oh, if you're going to be feeding your child all night, pick up some virtual shifts. That'll be great. So by thinking about frictionless access, whether it's copays or deductibles, and again, a lot of employers have $1,000 deductibles. What hits your deductible? It's not your $100,000, cancer treatment or $50,000, right? It's your primary care visits or you're filling the prescription on a routine thing. So, and interestingly, the HSA and deductible rules are actually in IRS tax policies. There are things that are pre-deductible, but they were hard coded into some of these tax bills. And why it's hard to change, having tried to talk to folks about this, is it's tax law. It's actually tricky. But I think to Ted's point, if we can make access more frictionless, whether it's copay, whether it's deductibles, whether it's wait times, whether it's people who look like me, whether it's people who understand my background, reduce that friction and get people to engage sooner, earlier, and frankly, cost part of the health system, we see a lot of benefits for that. So I think these things are connected, and I think digital health, health equity, cost sharing, these things connect. But frankly, we've also seen, and I'll wrap it up, even with great means and resources and access, people don't want to engage in their healthcare. And what we've learned from kind of human-centered design over the years is making things easy to use is more powerful than incentives. We always talk in healthcare, we just want to change the incentives, whether it's deductibles or copay, or we're going to pay the provider. Just make it easy. And the easier you make it, people will use this a dozen times a year versus 1 to 2 times. And so I think, and that's an innovation that's doesn't take breakthrough technology, right? The reimbursement systems and those things do, but it's how do you make things easy to use? How do you make the right choice or the best choice for people, the easiest choice as well?
That's a great set of points. And maybe Ted, I'd love to ask you a follow-up question. Obviously, looking backwards in time, we see a lot of disparities in terms of the patient populations who have early access or sometimes access at all to certain kinds of therapies. Do you see this changing? And I'll maybe give one very specific example from the corner of the world that I live in. It's looking like probably the first CRISPR-based medicine that will get approved in the United States is for sickle cell disease. And that seems pretty remarkable, but obviously you have a broader landscape view for that space. I'd love your perspective on what you see coming in the future.
Yeah, I think that we will make progress. I mean, Rachel, as you know, I'm infectiously optimistic always. I think you have to be optimistic, quite frankly, to be in our business. But as Amir just said, we could genetically correct a sickle cell patient, but if we send that kid back to a neighborhood where he can't get basic food, where there's inadequate education, where there's crime on the street, that's did we spend our money wisely? I mean, I think it's a good question for us to be asking is, how do we allocate our resources to do the most good? And I am a huge, as you know, advocate of science and innovation and technology. But ultimately, we could help a lot of people by doing very, very basic things, as Amir said.
Excellent, excellent. Joe.
Yeah, so maybe I want to just ask Ted and ask Amir and others in terms of this conundrum that we have. That is, we want to deliver healthcare to everybody. We have the best health, basically the most technological advances in the whole world. We spend, I don't know, the GDP is probably 18% by now compared to other countries in UK, in Japan, in which it's about 10%. But yet, when we translate into outcome, we're not doing better compared to UK, Japan, and many other countries. And then most recently, the most blatant example is just the vaccine, right? I mean, the vaccine is effective, but yet you have a lot of people who don't want to take it. And so how do you, obviously we want to deliver the best care, but in the very simple example of the vaccine, we have a hard time convincing the American public to take it. And then so you might think about fast forward in the next 5, 10, 15 years, any kind of therapies that you have, the implementation process, even though it's clear cut, just like a vaccine, very difficult to implement that, especially in our country. And it's almost like, democracy gave us the most amount of freedom, but in this case, at the healthcare delivery, it also is our Achilles heel. So I just want to ask Amir, ask people who are in healthcare delivery to kind of take a crack at this. Yeah.
Thanks for throwing a softball out there, Joe. Well, yeah, not to go too far afield, but I think we have our own dynamics in our own country, right? And we see this playing out in the vaccine of this, if you will, opposing views of individual rights versus the social good. And I think, unfortunately, what we're all kind of medical healthcare professionals has gotten tied up into who gets to make the decision and at what level of government, and is it the individual, the company, and look, in California, the work that we do straddles different counties. Each county has different rules. It has a different health commissioner. The state has its own rules, and the feds, let alone any individual. So, but that is our country. That's our nation. Those are the dynamics. So I kind of then assume that persists. It's probably more likely to persist than not. What could we have done better? And I think there's a ton of things we can and could do better. I think one of the things that worked pretty well is we did leverage industry, whether it was on the development side, and I think their government and again, not my area of expertise, but procured early things that didn't yet have FDA approval and maybe weren't going to have it, and so we were pre-developing. Obviously, we had a bunch of EUAs and those kind of things, and then we saw actually using these existing health ecosystems didn't solve disparity issues necessarily, but did help in implementation, right? So there were existing providers, systems, pharmacy systems, others where, could have gone a lot better, granted, but actually we did get things out, out into the public. And so now thinking forward, okay, how would we do these things better, differently? So, and frankly, I think if the government early on used the existing ecosystem, it would have gone even faster. There was a lot of controls. California is classic. Who distributes the vaccines? Well, Fed, then went to the states. Then if you're a big health system, you got your own allocation. If you're a small primary care provider, you got zero. Then they contracted with Blue Shield of California. So I was calling Paul Markovich for vaccinations. Then it went to the California site. And this was like 9-12 months. In March of 2020, One Medical did like 2 to 3% of all the COVID testing. Why? We were up in 2 or 3 days. Boom. Had interfaces with LabCorp and Quest, had tubes set up in a parking lot, had an IT system, go. Took me like 2 years to actually procure things and had to go through this, convoluted approach. And again, it's easy to critique in hindsight, but I do think those things going forward, we can do pretty well. We actually have great providers and delivery systems that did respond. So again, I'm optimistic about it. I don't think we're going to change the dynamic in our country, but hopefully we can depoliticize these things. And this isn't about individual rights versus government controls. It's like vaccine and testing are available easily wherever you go to get care. And if you don't have a place to go to get care, here are other places to go. And because it frankly wasn't very ubiquitous. Still not extremely ubiquitous. Easy to use more than incentives, I would still lean towards. So I think easy to use. And then again, not my area of expertise, but maybe some others here can comment to this. I sure hope we've got on the federal and state side more pre-planning going on. Where is funding going from an NIH perspective? I think from the care delivery sides, we're practicing all the time. Every health system has got emergency plans. And again, it was far from perfect, but I think all considering they responded pretty darn well with ICU influxes and PPE and the like. So I don't know if a good answer, Joe, but I do think industry can respond, of course, needs government partnership.
I mean, I think,
That's,
Joe, part of your question gets to sort of these two very different concepts. One is acute care, and the other is everything else, be it preventative, wellness care, however we want to describe it. And taking maybe the lens of the world that I live in of genome editing, those two are viewed incredibly differently. For example, patients and their families are incredibly open to the concept of these, newfangled technologies. When they're very ill, they're being told by their physicians that they have no other options. And this is a potential way to extend their life or potentially cure their disease. Very few are asking questions about, what is genome editing and how does it work, and having concerns on that front. And yet the exact same technologies companies in the agriculture setting are really struggling to deploy, to use to edit crops, to try to solve drought tolerance and other challenges that are significantly impacting access to food on our planet. And yet that's not an acute challenge that the consumer faces at the grocery store. And so there's been, huge pushback by a number of different consumer groups against using the exact same kinds of technologies in the food setting, whereas they're being embraced in the healthcare setting. Years ago, one of my colleagues predicted that someday there will be a genome edited politician, meaning someone who's received one of these genetic medicines, who is lobbying against genome edited foods. And it's really funny to think about, but actually really fits a lot of the emotional reactions that we have seen on both ends of the spectrum.
As a non-healthcare provider, if I can comment on this, so with no knowledge whatsoever, but a couple of things I would say. If I look back and try to divide up what happened with COVID and the experiences into sort of a strategic and a tactical, from a strategic standpoint, this was amazing, right? It's been 14 months, really, that we've had, vaccines being approved for at least emergency use. And what are we, 8-9 billion doses delivered globally? That is truly amazing when you think about that. Then when you look on the tactical side, which is a lot of the things that we're talking about, there were a lot of missteps, a lot of frictions. I really resonate with Amir's description of make it easier, because that's the place where I think there's going to be a huge amount of Monday morning quarterbacking and trying to figure out how to improve the coordinations between federal, state, local, between the distributions, what goes into the national stockpile and how does it get distributed in an emergency. So all those things that we just didn't do well this time. So I think that those are, but at the big picture on the strategic side, I mean, it's just amazing. And it's a lot of the people that are here on this, Zoom call that actually made that difference. And that you should be very, very proud of that. In terms of the improving the public health and dialogue, and clearly, it's not just in the US, but even internationally, some of the disconnects between science and emotion. I actually saw this morning, in the New York Times, Tom Friedman's got a wonderful little op-ed about free speech versus taking responsibility. So I recommend that for anybody to see the kind of distinction that can be made. In that case, he's talking about the Spotify issue, but it applies equally well to, I think, what we've witnessed in the dialogue nationally on the vaccine.
Yeah. I mean, I think somebody made a comment that in the future we'll be doing about 40% wellness. I just also want to push back on that a little bit. That in our country, in particular, very, very difficult to implement this. Very different compared to other more socialistic countries like in Europe and in Asia, in which it's much, much easier to implement this wellness across the board. I'm sure some of you may have seen this. I mean, I follow the medical news, like, at Brigham and Women's Hospital, there's a patient that's being refused heart transplant because he doesn't want to take the COVID vaccine. Imagine going through a, probably $1 million procedure for a heart transplant, yet the patient doesn't want to get vaccinated. And think about the two clinical different dynamics with that scenario. We could provide the best care, but yet a simple wellness prevention, the patient doesn't want it. And this has to do with the dynamics of how much money we could afford in terms of healthcare delivery, but also dynamics in terms of individual rights that we have in the country. Yeah.
Yeah, what seems like simple questions, but there are no simple answers to these. They're all multifactorial. We have about 7 minutes left here, I think, for discussion. You want to continue on COVID, or is there another topic that someone would like to focus on?
Hey, Walter, I wouldn't mind jumping in just a little bit on the AI digital health piece. There's lots of different lenses to this.
Go for it.
But, just take on the surgery side, trying to enable minimally invasive surgery in different settings. It's so much better for the patient, shorter lengths of stay, fewer complications. There's a huge financial underpinning that goes along with the clinical benefit with these types of things, as well as, shorter OR times and things like that. So that's why robotics is quite hard, because, they can enable these types of things, not all as cost effectively as you'd like, but on the AI and digital side for a robot, for example, this is how it's allowed to be used today. For example, you could maybe auto edit down a 3 or 4 hour surgery down into 2-minute clips, show a surgeon, when his arms are all in fields, show him all his different cautery events, show him any blood loss kind of areas. So there's all sorts of institutional and surgeon learning and support that can happen, from a post-operative sense in that regard. But then there's a path maybe where you could use different techniques for maybe intra-procedure types of support, from identifying tumor margins with fluorescence imaging and doing some guidance for the surgeon in a more robust way using these types of techniques in real time. And then, of course, there's a journey over time that may get to an automated a type of approach. So in all these types of devices, health IT aside, so much enabling and the digital and things like this, but on the device side, it's these types of techniques that are looking for these, cost effectiveness improvements, efficacy improvements using these different areas. So, you need all these different types of, it's a fusion of these different types of technologies all coming together to enable just in the surgery realm, for example.
Thank you. Anyone want to add to what John has said on that space?
I'll add just some small examples of the use in AI that we're doing in digital health and One Medical. And part of it is maybe a little bit to what John was describing, helps improve, if you will, provider productivity and the patient experience. So there's a huge crisis of burnout in physicians in the United States. National Academies of Medicine, amongst many others, have written about this. In primary care, it's about 50%, and family physicians are showing signs of burnout, and you have it in other specialties as well. And what's burning them out? And it's a lot of studies on this, but there's a few things. One of which is what I like to call the heavy burdens of desktop medicine, or we're taking care of the computer but not the patient. And that's documentation, it's coding, it's all the messages, getting paid a fee for every visit, but then having to do all the other work is frustrating, and then trying to coordinate care. So we try to solve those things, and we do that in part by developing our own technology. And so one way we're using machine learning and natural language processing is, if I message my physician, we have an NLP layer that reads that message. And if it's something routine, it'll pull it out of our inbox and it will move it to one of our virtual team members, those folks who can work from home all along. And by the way, if it's not clinical, it won't move it to a clinician, it can move it to an administrative person. Oh, as it ends up, a large majority of those are not very clinical. I have these questions about referral, authorization, or prescription renewal. I had a question on this, how do I follow up? And so we're finding, just in our technology, our EHR, if you will, that we built from scratch, we have about 45% less work, almost half the work that a primary care physician would see in other systems. And just like when we do a Google search, right, it's auto-completing or anticipating what we're going to type. Some very not glitzy innovations that really save a lot of keystrokes. Well, saving a few minutes of keystrokes per patient per day is a lot. And so one of the other fun metrics that we look at is, I call it the 4 p.m. WIP, the 4 p.m. work in process. How much work in process does the provider have in their inbox at 4 p.m.? It's a crude measure, but we try to take it down, and I tell our technology team, this is the goal. And kind of like Congress used to do, which they don't do anymore, I call it a pay for. If you want the physician to do more, you have to pay for it with less keystrokes, less work, less clicks, because we know that's going to ultimately be correlated with burnout. And same on the consumer experience, right? And we see this in consumer technologies, in really great consumer apps. What's the quickest way, right? One click and I've already purchased this thing, right? Healthcare doesn't have a lot of one clicks, right? There's a lot of many clicks. So I think there are innovations that we can do on our own workflow that can make tremendous breakthroughs. And then there's more exciting things in terms of how do we take broad data sets, and Ted and others talked about wearable and other external data. We port in electronic health records from health systems and then anticipate the needs of people, predict who's going to be more complex, and then frankly reach out in the modality that we think they'll be most responsive to. But again, a lot of that is not hard to imagine future state. That's pretty much tools and technologies that we have today. It's engineering it together into a tool set that can work.
Amir, thank you. I think that's the final word in this session. But Paul, I think back to you. You have the floor.
Well, thank you, Walter. You did a great job in keeping this conversation on track. We could go for all day. I love hanging around super smart people who are not only creating the future, but also dealing with the current challenges. And I think it's an amazing job, guys. So I learned a lot, and I appreciate all the panelists joining us today.